Hi everybody, I'm Hayley Victoria and welcome back to my crime and policing channel. In today's session we are looking at managing risk. So if you are a PCDA student or a DHEP student or you're doing PPD or whatever avenue you are doing to get into the police, managing risk is a massive part of your job. It will be huge whether or not you're doing the traditional entry route, so the IPLDIP, whether or not you're studying policing or criminology or other criminal justice disciplines. Managing risk, looking after vulnerable people should be one of the key things you are doing. It is a massive focus for the police nationally, and it's super important that victims, vulnerable people are treated really well and their own personal circumstances and stuff and the risks that they have to themselves towards vulnerability are taken into account when you are processing people, whether or not they are victims, witnesses or suspects. So anybody can be vulnerable. It doesn't matter whether they've committed the crime or they're the recipient of this crime. No matter who they are, they could be vulnerable. And it's really important that when we are looking at vulnerable people, we're looking at risk to society, everyone's individual factors are taken into consideration. Now, in terms of managing risk, we don't just look at vulnerable people, we look at all of different things that help to ensure that we police better continuously over time. So there has been a review recently of the police services, and South Yorkshire Police has come out as really good in relation to protecting vulnerable people. How amazing is that? Especially after some of the stuff in the not so distant history that have happened in relation to protecting vulnerable people. But because of those things that have happened, the lessons learned and the things are put into practice, now they are at the top force in relation to this type of crime. So let's have a look at managing risk in the PCDA arena. So you will have, if you're studying PCDA, you'll have a number of units throughout the year, or modules, which they might be called. Now these modules make up all the different credits you need for the full course at the end. So managing risk is 20 of those points that you need to get your full degree at the end. So it's a first year subject, so if you are studying the PCDA, it's broken up into 3 years. There's something you'll study in year one, but you'll also pick up again throughout, but it'll be called slightly different things. It'll be elevated to risk society and its implications, for example, because protecting vulnerable people is a thread that weaves through policing from day one all until you retire and probably come back as a police trainer. So let's discuss what it actually means in terms of what you need to do for uni then. So you will, depending where you study, you'll do a mixture of blended learning. So it could be you do online lectures, you go in for your lectures. Where I teach at the moment, we work very close with South Yorkshire Police, and our teachers go in with South Yorkshire Police, and we have a proper joint approach on there now, which is awesome. So you get the experts and you get your academics, and it's a lovely mixture of both. And yeah, it's working, fingers crossed, quite well so far. So yeah, you're managing risk. You will have a delivered content, whether that's online, in person or whatever. You'll have this content delivered, and then at the end of this period of time, where I am, it's 2 weeks, you'll be expected to do some form of assessment, whether or not that's immediately after or later down on your timetable, depending on whether you're working, because you know how it works with shifts and things and workplace time. So however it fits, you will be asked to do an assessment after you've done the studying. Obviously, you're not going to make you do an assessment before you get the content. That would be very weird. So after this content that you've had delivered, then, like I said, you'll be expected to do an assessment. So it depends where you are, depending on how the assessment is done, but the requirements are the same nationally. That's because it's from the PEQF. So everything that you get in terms of PCDA, your DEP, etc., come from the PEQF, which is your Policing Education Qualification Framework. Now, they dictate what we have to do in terms of universities and providers in relation to what we want you to achieve, because it's a national qualification. So the assessment criteria is the same nationally. But where I am, we ask you to do a presentation somewhere else, I don't know, Loughborough or whatever, I don't know, just made that up, might want you to do a written essay. It doesn't really matter because the assessment criteria are the same. Somebody might make you do it through song and dance or miming. I don't think that's on the list. But anyway, however we assess you, the criteria is the same nationally. So there's 3 assessment criteria that you need to satisfy for managing risk. And the first one I'm going to read directly from my brief, which I'm going to pop on the screen for you as well. Examine the national drivers for the police service in providing a professional and ethical service to vulnerable persons. Okay, so that sounds a bit wordy, but when it says national drivers, it's talking about the spark that created change. So something has happened. There's been a driver for change. So examples for this could be if you're looking at domestic abuse. So within managing risk, you've got categories that you can choose to focus your work on, whether that's domestic abuse, CSE and CCE, organised crime groups, or county lines and trafficking. We've got 4 that we'll look at where I am now. So if you're looking at domestic abuse, you might look at the case of Claire Wood. So I've discussed this in a previous video. If you have seen this, so Claire was tragically murdered by her ex-partner, who, had she known about the abuse that he'd done to previous women, she would never have been with him. But she didn't know about that. And that's where, after Claire's obviously horrible murder, her family campaigned for change. And then that change changed the law. So, and the procedures we use. So we've now got the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, or Claire's Law, which has come from that national driver for change. Okay, does that make sense? So have a think about stuff like that. So it could be other things. If you're looking at you know, CSE or CCE, you might want to look at something like Sarah's Law for child sexual abuse. If you think about CSE on a bigger scale, there's a Rotherham scandal and the Alexis J report, which changed policing. So all these different things, these drivers for change that you could look at. So it says here, like, how we would then assess whether or not you've hit that. So I'm going to pop my brief on the screen again. So as I've mentioned, I read out the criteria, and then we will be judging you on whether or not you examined a range of national drivers relating to the provision of ethical services to vulnerable individuals, which is what that first thing says. And then for a typical pass, it says what you need to do here. So it identify and examines at least one driver and the links between this and the provision of service. So like I mentioned, the case of Claire Wood, you then might want to look at how the campaign subsequently led to the change in procedures. And now we've got the DVDS, the Claire's Law, Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme. So that's your first one. Then it's going to ask you here, look, so define vulnerability and examine the background and legislative considerations around vulnerability. Influences, key considerations, and the appropriate actions available to police officers and other agencies. Okay, so defining vulnerability then, make sure when you define vulnerability it's in relation to managing risk. So you don't want to be using some rando quote from, like, I don't know, vulnerable cats or something. It's got to be in relation to what you're looking at. So whether or not you get this definition from the College of Policing, Women's Aid perhaps, somewhere else where it's in relation to what you are studying. So vulnerability in relation to domestic abuse or whatever. You're not looking at, because lots of things can be vulnerable. The infrastructure of a building could be vulnerable, but we're not bothered about that. We're looking at it in relation to crime. So you define vulnerability and it has to be relevant, the definition you're using. And then it's on about legislative considerations, influences, key considerations, and appropriate actions. So now we're looking at policing in relation to vulnerability. The College of Policing is great for this. You want to look at things like the vulnerability assessment framework, and then we're going to start looking at things like the personal and situational factors that make somebody vulnerable. Now, using these and analysing these sources will prove that you've got a deeper level of understanding. Now, that's when you start getting your higher grades. If you just define vulnerability and that's it, and people are a bit vulnerable because, I don't know, she's a girl, what? That's not enough. So, I mean, it's also a massive sweeping statement. I'm a girl, but I'm also a brown belt at martial arts. but you know, we're all different levels of vulnerability. Let's not make sweeping statements. So, defining vulnerability, make sure you use a relevant quote, and then start to look at things that help policing analyse, identify, and mitigate these risks. So then here, look, defines and analyses key issues of vulnerability and explores how these relate to issues of practice. So that's something that we are looking for you to do. And then a typical pass, you provided examples of aspects of individual vulnerability and how these relate to practice. So if we're looking at the personal and situational factors of somebody, maybe they've got ACEs, they've got mental ill health, etc. Situational factors, perhaps they have been isolated from their family and friends, they don't know anybody in their area, they're currently out of work, they're dependent on somebody else for finances. So this is how you can start assessing whether people are vulnerable and then how it impacts on the practice as well. If you're looking at things like domestic abuse, if a person, like I said, maybe they've got their own personal factors, maybe they've got anxiety, low self-esteem issues, they are struggling with their mental health and their well-being, and situational factors are nowhere near home, they've not got a support system in terms of people, they can't afford to support themselves financially, maybe they don't have access to technology and stuff, and that's all increasing that vulnerability and how we go about supporting them. So think about things like that. And obviously the vulnerability assessment framework, or the VAF as it's often referred to as well. So make sure you have a thorough discussion about that. Now, when you are having these discussions within your work, whether it's a presentation or it's an essay or whatever, make sure you put some references in there. So quote things, because that means you've looked at this information, you've analysed it, you've rationalised it, and you've gone, that's what it means. You're showing that you can link all this information and articulate it in a way that shows you've understood it. So you're not just listing stuff. It's great that you can find things and list it, but if you can analyse stuff and, you know, put your own evaluative and critical thinking on it, that shows a higher level of understanding, and that is where you're going to start getting your firsts. Okay, I want you to get good grades, guys. I want firsts. Okay, so the last assessment criteria for managing risk: examine the key definitions, legislation, impact and considerations of public protection policing. Again, depending on what it is you are looking at, a lot of people choose to do domestic abuse. I think that's because it's such a focus of the police in the UK, because it is massive, isn't it? So a lot of people choose to do domestic abuse. So when you're looking at legislation, if you don't put in the basics like the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, you're instantly setting off on the wrong foot. When you're looking at legislation, you want to put in everything you can that's relevant to the area you are focusing on in your managing risk area in relation to, you know, helping vulnerable people. So public protection policing. Equally, if you're doing about CSE and CCE, you look at those laws and legislations popped in there as well. And again, with the gangs and other stuff, your county lines and trafficking. So yeah, you want to put the relevant legislation in, what you're looking at. So, and don't just list that either. It's great that you found it. Well done. Now make those links into how they change. Maybe if you're looking at the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, how things such as non-fatal strangulation is now in there, and what that can now lead to and why it's in there. So maybe the percentage of people who go on from the non-fatal strangulation to killing their spouses. So all these types of information and things, why that's been put in there. And then you want to discuss other things as well, so policies and practices. You're looking at domestic abuse, you should include DASH. So your domestic abuse, stalking, harassment and honour-based violence forms. So you want to be looking at DASH because that's important, or your DARA as it's going to become now. You want to be looking at your DVPNs, your DVPOs. You want to be looking at, again, linking back to Clare's Law, your Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, and anything about your vulnerable adult, maybe vulnerable child stuff as well. So you're showing that whole understanding of that. And again, don't just list stuff, analyse and discuss. I mean, it's not been that long since Priti Patel put that thing in about how to properly change domestic abuse. Now I put like a register and all that kind of stuff on there. Bring all this kind of stuff in, because again, that shows your level of understanding. So with our brief then, provide examples of key definitions and legislation, define domestic abuse, define all these other, maybe coercive control, non-fatal strangulation, stuff you might be looking at in relation to the subject you are looking at. Articulate how this relates to practice, consider the impact legislation and policy has on practice. So now we've got stuff like Dash. Dash is amazing. So some people are like, oh God, every domestic abuse I've got to do a Dash form. Yes, you have. You absolutely have got to do a Dash form. You're not going to get, it'd be very, very rare for you to turn up to the first domestic call from a person and for that relationship to end there. Very rare. Or for that to be the first instance of domestic abuse in that relationship. That is very rare. So domestic abuse tends to build over time. So it tends to be something where it just starts off with little kind of actions and then it becomes more and more controlling and abusive over time as a victim starts to kind of forget what's happening. So this, have you heard of gaslighting and things like that? People might take them a while to realise actually they are in an abusive relationship, and it might take them a while again after they've realised to feel confident enough to call the police. It might be that they didn't even call the police. It might be a neighbour has called the police because of some noise, some disturbance. You turn up, the victim's there, they don't want to talk. It might be that they're not ready, they're in fear. It might be that perhaps those factors we've talked about, it might be even that the person that's abusing them is their only support. They might be their only income there. Without this person, they might not have a house. They might not be able to feed themselves. So they're weighing up this, what do I do situation. And there's that fear as well. If you tell anybody, it might come back 20 times worse than it was before. So yes, you have to do a dash every time you go. Because it might just be that one time you go, you do that dash, you tell you something they've not told you before. It might be they're ready to talk, and then you can start. They might open up, they might trust you, and you can put stuff in place for that victim. So yes, you have to do dash. So anyway, I digressed. Dash is super important, and it might be that you link that to the changes in law, etc. So the practice is really, really good. What else do you have to do? Like I said, DVPN, DVPO, discuss those, and your vulnerable adult, vulnerable child. So there's lots of stuff you can do, and make sure you include all of that. So typically, to pass, we'll be looking for you to identify and examine key legislation and offer limited examples of how these impact on practice. And that's to pass, limited examples. If you want to get a good grade, which I hope you will do, you'll put some good examples in there. I just mentioned Dash. We're looking at the domestic violence disclosure scheme. It might be elaborating more on the national things that are happening now in relation to the changes that Patel discussed. So this is what you're looking at in terms of managing risk. So they are your assessment criteria. Easy, right? I've just described them all. Now, it's all right having all of that. That's super. But now you're at university and you've also got to show that you can analyse and discuss these at a higher level. And that's where you start having to use things like external sources to support your analysis. If you're just waxing lyrical and riffing about domestic abuse, it's great that you've got all that knowledge in there, but says who? You've got to back it up with some credible evidence. So you want to be doing some research. This means more than just websites as well. I mean, having websites is a start, don't get me wrong, but having more than that as well. Look at journals, look at books, and include these in your works. So you need citations. Even if you're doing a presentation, you've got slides to support it, put your citations on there. And then at the end of your work, you must include a reference list. So your reference list, there's some basics here. So people get references wrong all the time. I'm sure I still get references wrong all the time. Max one or two little things, maybe a full stop here or there or whatever. So it's important that you check them all the time. But there are things to help you. There are tools. So where I am at Sheffield Hallam, we've got Hallam Help, which supports people. You can also get like these like websites that create them for you. However, be careful with these websites that create them because they don't always pull all the data through, and you might have to enter things yourself like authors, etc. Because if you don't, then it'll just have no author and it just all goes wrong. So make sure you've got some idea of how to do references before you just rely on a website. So with your references then, just some quick tips. It has to be in alphabetical order. So that's your first one. And by surname. So it's not, say it was me, you wouldn't put Haley Victoria. It'd be Victoria H. You wouldn't put Haley Victoria whatever. You do it by alphabetical order when you're looking at people's names, surname, and then their initial. Then you put the year in brackets. So Victoria H full stop, year in brackets 2023 full stop, and then the title of whatever it is in italics, I am awesome full stop, and then it'll be the publisher. So I'm looking at something, Green Jumper Publishing, etc. And that's how it works. That's your basic structure of a reference. But if you are struggling, get some support, because when you're grading this work, we have things called rubrics, and a rubric is like a big list of all the things we grade you against. And your academic writing skills for referencing and external sources are part of that rubric. Now, you could do a great discussion on the 3 points I've talked about their assessment criteria. You could get that nailed on, but you don't use any references, you're losing points. You don't analyse and discuss stuff, you're losing points. So these little things that you need to do to show this wider level of critical thinking, you might think, oh, I don't need to do that, I'm a cop. Yeah, you do. You need to do that because you're a cop. We need to make sure that you can critically analyse things, that you can think outside of the box, that you can rationalise your thoughts, so you don't just go gung-ho into things, trashing about in your Altbergs. You've got to make sure that you know what you're doing and you can think critically. Think of the NDM here, guys. You've got to be able to use all of this stuff, articulate something and why, justify your actions. And that's why we asked you to do this stuff. Anyway, I hope that's useful. If you've got any questions at all, please do drop me a message. I am on YouTube, as you know, because you're watching me on here. And I'm also on Instagram, Haley Victoria Crime. I think I'm on Facebook as well, Haley Victoria Crime. And I'm on LinkedIn, because I'm of an age where everyone has LinkedIn. So if you would like to ask any questions, please let me know. That's it. In the meantime, stay safe, look after each other, and please do not commit any crimes.